So I want to welcome Dr. Willie McLeod back to our Nine Ages podcast. And I want to take a second to just welcome everybody else that's been following us. We've been receiving some really nice questions. And in all honesty, I've had some really nice discussions because of the videos as well. So thank you guys for taking the time and supporting us. So Willie, today we're going to discuss the book, The Nine Ages. Very, very interesting work. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I want to start off with a little question. What actually made you decide to write the book Nine Ages in the first place?
Yeah, so our channel is also called After the Nine Ages. The Nine Ages of history, divided in a different way than before. We'll come to that. So the reason for the book was actually to serve as a prologue for the Nephilim trilogy that I've written previously. So in the Nephilim trilogy, there are actually three books in the trilogy. The first
Yes, I
one,
can.
yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, okay, yeah. So the first one is about this very early period, the great heroic age, when God kings ruled the known world. So it's the pre-Diluvian, the post-Diluvian period, the Akkadian period. So that's more or less until the time of Abraham in terms of biblical history. And then the second book is mostly about the Mediterranean world, Canaan, the Anakim, everything that happened in that world. And then the third book is about the European world and how Nephilim traditions had been carried to Europe, the European continent, and also later on how it evolved and survived within European history. So this book, this Nephilim, Nine Ages of the Nephilim, was just a short work to serve as a kind of prologue and introduction to the Nephilim as a topic in general.
Yes, and I can just let the listeners know that it provides a very concise, accessible prologue to the larger Nephilim trilogy. So it sort of pulls everything together in a bit more of a coherent timeline. So to start off, if you've never sort of studied the Nephilim, it would be a good thing to start off with the Nine Ages. Anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so the reason why we decided to um, uh, divide the history of the Nephilim into nine ages. In the first place, what I discovered is that the Nephilim is not only enigma of the past. It's not only something that has reference to the antediluvian and post-diluvian periods, and later on in Canaan with the Anakim that the Bible also
Yeah.
refers to. It's actually a continuous tradition. We find a continuous
Yes.
tradition. The moment that we start looking outside the Bible, that we involve extra biblical sources, that we look at dynasties, bloodlines, families, and so forth, that believe themselves to have been descendants of the gods, we find a continuous tradition throughout history. This is extremely important. And what also happens is that we find two opposing currents. On the one hand, we find a continuous Nephilim tradition, and since the earliest of times, we find that there were actually two opposing traditions. We have a tradition opposing this Nephilim tradition that also existed long before the Bible was written. And that's also extremely interesting. So I discussed that in the Nine Ages.
Yeah, absolutely. You're looking at Sumer, you're looking at Egypt, you're looking at the Hittites, and then that recurring motive of the divine kings. And you also see the thing, the hybrid beings and the bloodlines that seem to just sort of echo through or across the eras. So very, very interesting. The moment you see it, you can't unsee it. So my next question would be, what sets the Nine Ages apart from other interpretations of ancient history, and specifically the Nephilim?
Yeah, so most other interpretations see the Nephilim as beings from the past, as giants actually that lived sometime in the past, in the distant past. And the problem with that view, in my opinion, is that it was, in the first place, the Nephilim does not only refer, the term doesn't only refer to giants. When we go, for example, to Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, we don't read about giants in that passage. We only read about great heroes, men of renown. So what we do find in history are some of the great kings, god kings of that early period, were regarded as Nephilim. And in the biblical tradition, for example, we have reference to Nimrod. Now, Nimrod corresponds with an extra biblical figure in this regard, most likely in Merkar. He was a Sumerian king. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that these two, the biblical and the extra biblical traditions, are basically two versions of the same original tradition. And what we then find is it's not only giants that's being referred to when we talk about Nephilim. It's also great kings that ruled in the past and also great heroes. And this changes a lot. So now we can follow these families' traditions. There's a lot of stuff involved here. The cults, they have a certain mythos related to their being in the world, seeing themselves in terms of the starry heavens, linking themselves with certain positions of the stars. In fact, the ancient land of Sumer, as well as Egypt, was laid out, geographically speaking, in such a way that it reflects the starry heavens. And it's in this context that they used the sacred marriage to reincarnate, so they believe, actually, these starry beings, these heavenly gods on earth. So it's a fascinating story.
Billy, just to interrupt you, you mentioned the sacred marriage. I mean, we don't want to go into too much of a discussion around that, but can you just, for those that don't know what that refers to, just mention it?
Yeah, so the sacred marriage was very important in ancient Sumer. I think that's more or less most likely where it originated, even in the period before the deluge. So they was very much interested in fertility. That was the most important factor for those people, in the southern marshes of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. And they had this yearly ritual of the high priest or the king that actually had a carnal relation that particular night on the vernal.
The Eros Gamos.
Yeah, that's what it's called. Yeah, on the vernal equinox. And he slept with the high priestess, and it was believed that during that occasion that a god actually took possession of the high priest, and that he then fathered a son or sons that were of superhuman descent. So that's why yeah.
Perfect. I just mention that would be Dumuzi or Tammuz, that and the goddess of love would be Inanna and Ishtar, but yeah. Perfect. So, Vinny, in your view, what's the biggest misconception people have about the Nephilim? And how do you see them differently?
Yeah, so the first thing is that most people think that the Nephilim are actually just giants in the past, because they don't think in terms of great kings, great heroes, as it's actually explicitly stated in Genesis 6 verse 4. The other problem is that they, for example, read the book of Enoch, which dates from about 300 BC. And in reading it, they believe that this gives us a good view of what happened in the time before the deluge. Now, that's more than 3,000 years before that time.
Yeah.
So that's just not the case. The book of Enoch, or books of Enoch, picks a lot up from the Mesopotamian tradition, also from Jewish tradition. It connects with the biblical tradition. But the point of the matter is, the Book of Enoch cannot be taken as a reliable source with regard to the historical situation in the time before the Deluge, the time of Enoch, etc. So although it's insightful and we can get some basic motives, that's not wrong in the Book of Enoch, we should actually rather look at other extra biblical sources that date from that early period.
Yeah.
So a last part of my work is actually to engage with extra biblical sources. For example, when in the first volume of my work, I engaged only in all 3 volumes with books, the sources, material from that ancient world, which date from that period as far as possible. So I will not use sources that's much later. I will not use contemporary sources from Freemasons or whatsoever to say something about the antediluvian world. It's just, in my opinion, it's just nonsense. So I use sources from that time, or which I have good reasons to believe that they are accurate description or actually traditions that survive from that time. So for the most part, my work is based on extra biblical traditions about the Nephilim. The Bible only says very, very little. 2 passages referring to the Nephilim. And then the Rephaim, which I actually discuss in detail in the second book. And also, but that's in that period. That's much later. Yeah.
Yes. And if you look at these extra biblical resources that you've used, I assume most of them reveal the Nephilim as corruptors of humanity, teaching forbidden arts, and establishing dynasties. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yeah. So, for example, the sacred marriage, we've talked about that. We find that during the Akkadian period, this cult, the Dumuzi, it was part of the Dumuzi cult. At that stage, it was already a very old cult going back to pre-Diluvian period, antediluvian period, and later on also the post-Diluvian period during the Uruk period, historically speaking. And that particular ritual and cult was actually recast in the form of an imperial cult by Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon the Great of Akkad. I discussed that in detail in the first book. And this cult survived the ages. I discuss how that survived, especially in the second volume, how it survived in Egypt later on during the time of the Middle Kingdom, the early Middle Kingdom. Also how it spread to, for example, Crete, how it eventually evolved in the cult of Eleusis, Athens, and even later on, our remnants of this cult survived in terms of the Grail romances in Europe. We have good reason to believe that it survived in some form. So that's one example. Many other examples can be given of how these cults related to the Nephilim, because the reason why this cult was important, I actually call it the Nephilim Church, because in this cult, the sacred marriage was very important, and during this marriage, they believed that certain diamonds, they were able to bring them back, and that they could be reincarnated in the circles. And so, for example, we find in Greek tradition, we have the Pelasgians. And in the Pelasgian traditions of ancient Greek, it's closely linked to traditions of giants. And the most important feature of these giants and these people are that they were born from the ground. Now, how were they born from the ground? That's closely linked to the Elysian cult. Because they believed that these spirits and diamonds were reborn into their midst. And that's how these giants came into being. That was part of the tradition. And that's a very similar tradition that we find already in ancient Uruk in Sumer. So that's just a very small part of a much larger answer.
Yes, that's absolutely fascinating. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people that weren't aware of that, so definitely worth looking into a bit more and perhaps looking at the book. So Yeah, so Billy, you're saying the Nephilim weren't just those mythic giants, but as you sort of refer to now, it's the start of a hidden bloodline that's run through history into today. Um, so, if that's true, what does it do to the story we've always believed about human history?
Yeah, so on the one hand, we have secular history. That's the
Yes,
history where we find certain reference to certain people, and especially in the early period, it's mostly legendary history. It was
yeah,
handed down by poets from the earliest of times because writing only came into being later on, about 2600. That's during the early dynastic, sort of the middle of the early dynastic period, just before the Akkadian period. And we actually have very few real literary texts from before the Earth 3 period. That's about
yeah,
2100 BC. So most of these traditions were written down at that stage. So they were handed down by poets. And we've discussed that in detail I think, in the second episode of our podcast. So what we do find is that these traditions were handed down, and I'm primarily focusing on tradition. So I'm not
yeah.
so much interested in particular arguments about certain evidence for giants. This is not what I do
Yes,
because there's very little evidence in this regard. And once we look at that, it can be just giantism that we find to this day. So in terms of the giants, that's called Nephilim. That's a very important tradition. And to go and find certain individuals, let's say Goliath or Goliath or so, the possibility of that happening, I mean, we can't even find the grave of David, which is much
yes,
better known.
yeah,
So finding these things in history, it's just so impossible. It's just not realistic to think it'll happen. So I do not focus on that. I focus on the
and that,
traditions that was handed
yes,
down, the stories that was told throughout the ages, and especially within the circles of these families. They retold these, and not only these families, a certain warrior castes, for example. There was a
yes,
particular warrior caste that existed from very early on, from the Uru period, where it was linked with the Kabanda. Later on, it
yeah,
was linked to the great Akkadian emperors, and the Anakim of biblical fame should also be understood in those terms. So it's it's not only families, but it's also certain families that trace their bloodlines back to the early Nephilim. Yeah, and believe
yeah.
that these Nephilim diamonds were reincarnated in their midst. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the fact that you look at the traditions because it sort of takes it one step away from going into this whole discussion about size and that kind of thing. So and it focuses more on what people did believe and are currently believing and how
yeah.
it runs through
So
the
to come
timeline.
back to the question, the difference between secular history and what we're doing is that these people, even though we can point them out in history, what is usually not done is to look into their speculative theology, the way that they
Yeah,
saw the world, the cosmos, their own place in that world, their kind of mythos, so to say. And they believed that they were born from the gods, their descendants, their line, lineage, etc. And I take it serious because these are not
mm,
ad hoc claims. I show in the book. It's
yeah,
definitely not. These are
mm,
historical claims that comes from the earliest of times and have been handed down in these families. And so this is a different aspect of history. This is where the Nephilim
yes,
law and everything comes into play, and how those people and the people of their time saw them, understood them. It's not only
mm,
how they are seen today in terms of secular history, which do not really go into those stuff.
yes, yes. Excellent, excellent. So Willie, why 9 ages? And how does this timeline turn our usual origin story upside down? I actually want to take a step back and say, just for people that haven't read the book yet, the first age is the antediluvian era of the Watcher's descent.
Yes, right.
Then post-flood survival in the second, through Mesopotamian empires in the third and fourth, Egyptian and Canaanite dominations in the fifth and sixth, Indo-European migrations in the seventh, and then medieval bloodlines in the eighth, now modern final age in the ninth.
Yeah, so I actually, tried to, when I look at the data, I grouped in a sort of natural way where things really grouped together nicely. I grouped these particular families, tales, stories, and so forth in terms of periods, 9 periods. And in the biblical history, for example, there's reference to the antediluvian period, the post-diluvian period in Genesis 6 verse 4. And then the next reference is to the Anakim in the time of the Israelites. So what I do is I fill that picture in, that large gap. And in that gap, between the post-diluvian period and the period of the Anakim, we have the period of the great god emperors, the Akkadian emperors, which some of them who believed that they were gods, and some like Naram Sin, who was actually even worshipped as a god during his own lifetime. Yeah. And then after that, we have got the migrations from Canaan into the Mediterranean region, the Pelasgians, I've talked about that, also to Italy, where these people were the forebears of the Julian family, from which Julius Caesar and eventually Augustus, the first emperor, originated. And he believed that he was a descendant of the gods, and he believed that he himself was God. His genius was worshipped. Yes. He wrote his own great deeds, and that included the great before his death, because he was worshipped as a god. Temples were built from while he was still alive. And his great deeds was actually the great deeds of the divine Augustus, and that was his own terminology.
His title, yes,
And then from the migrations of the Pelasgians towards Europe, we followed the story furthermore in Europe. The Merovingian period. They are especially important in our story, and how they survived through the Carolingian period just afterwards, how these families were actually described in an implicit way in terms of the Grails romances, where they couldn't openly discuss that, but it's definitely very, very clear that it refers to the Nephilim. Then after that, the new Akkadian age, where the Arcadia in Greece became a sort of symbol for the underground stream that flows in history. And in the final period that still lies in the future is the return of the Nephilim. So that's the major periods that I distinguish between now.
Yes, absolutely. Did you want to say anything about the relationship between 9 and the snake? That's sort of...
Yeah, well, the number 9 is actually, in my belief, the number of the snake. And they were also seen as the seed of the snake. We've discussed, in the previous episodes, the seed of the snake, and especially that verse in Genesis chapter 3. And they actually, the snake was the very important image used in their circles, also in their cults. And they were often described in those times as dragon. Because the serpent and the dragon were closely linked from early times. And as dragon seeds. That was just a different kind of terminology that we find among the Hurrians, which among themselves who regarded themselves as descendants of these Nephilim. And later on in Greece also. In Thebes, for example, in Lycia, for example, we have these families that believed themselves to have been dragon seed. That was known terminology from the ancient world. So the seed of the dragon, the seed of the serpent, that's exactly how these families saw themselves in history.
Yeah, absolutely. And 9's the number that cannot be destroyed.
There's a lot to say about it, but we don't have time today.
I can carry on, but so Willie, you pull from sources like the Book of Enoch. You did pull some of it, and we talked about the ancient myths. What's the single wildest example you came across of the survival or the influence of the Nephilim?
Yeah, so in the post-Diluvian period, in the biblical tradition, it's clearly linked with Nimrod. There's no doubt about it. And Nimrod was from the house of Uruk. Now, that very same dynasty, we also have, we know about the Sumerian equivalent. The same dynasty is just in two different traditions that the story were handed down, the biblical tradition as well as the Sumerian tradition. And in that tradition, the equivalent figure to Kish, the father of Nimrod, was Meshkiach-Kasher. So Kish is the shortened form of that name.
Yeah.
And in Nimrod, his equivalent is Meshkiach-Kasher. Is Imarkan. So you have the root of the name NMR in both cases. Now, the vowels change all the time. So it's actually the root of the name that stays the same, the consonants. And he did exactly the same things that the Bible ascribes to Nimrod, and also the Tower of Babel. We'll come back to that and discuss that in detail. So that particular family, because in the Sumerian king list we read that they were descended from the gods. Exactly the same thing that we find in the biblical traditions. Yeah, so I think that's a good example.
Yeah, great stuff. And if we were living in what you call the final age of the Nephilim saga, what should people be watching for today? I'm referring to science in culture, in power, in history. And is it a story that's sort of still playing out?
Yeah, so I distinguish 9 ages from the time before the flood, the antediluvian age being the first age. So we then presently live in the 9th age. But if you count from after the deluge, then there's one age that still awaits us, and that's the age of the return of the Nephilim. So there are certain bloodlines today, certain families that believe themselves to be Nephilim, descendants of the gods or the extraterrestrials. That's a modern way of repackaging these things.
That's a new thing, yes.
Yeah, they believe themselves. And I believe that the Antichrist eventually will be from one of these Nephilim lineages. So it's extremely important also in terms of the story that we are telling today. And for understanding current events, it's extremely important that we have a good picture of the Nephilim, because this tells us which other families to look out for. And I discuss that in detail in the 3rd volume, and of the book, and also a little bit in the 9 Ages and some of the other books.
Yeah, the guys that have been manipulating everything in the background.
I'm not really into conspiracy stuff, I do discuss the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, etc. in the 3rd volume, but only in terms of what we really know and what we have good evidence for, and especially how they developed, and where they originated, families that played an important role, how certain groupings survived. So I'm not really into speculating about all sorts of stuff which are not evidence. I like evidence.
And I think that's a very good point to make. And I think that's people should take note of that. What you do is absolutely evidence-based.
Yes.
Any final thoughts?
No, I think the Nephilim story is a fascinating story. I've been studying it for more than 30, actually nearly 40 years, more than 30 years. Yeah. And it took a very long time to start to get the whole story together, to see the underlying linkages between the different parts of the story, to see how the one part of the story evolved to the other parts, and to eventually arrive at a continuous tradition. And that was just, this whole story and the Nephilim lore through the ages, and how it impacted, for example, in the time of Christ and afterwards, and throughout the European history and in the past. It's just fascinating. That's all I can say. It's fascinating. And what I've done in the 3 volumes, I've tried to use, for example, good fiction, Lord of the Rings and so on, also to cast some light on some of these historical events, to give the readers a better idea. And I tell some stories about, we've visited so many places. We've We've made
Yeah.
9 Grail or 7 Grail
Yes.
journeys to
Yes.
the Middle East, to Iran, to all over the place, all around
Yeah.
the Black Sea. We've been to Crimea, which is nowadays part of Russia. We've been all over the
Yes.
Mediterranean world, Europe. So we visited those places and we went to see for ourselves
Yeah.
what's going on there. So it's just a marvelous story, I think.
It's been a fascinating adventure.
Yeah, I would like to take the listeners with us on this adventure
Yes.
and, for them to ask and be part of the community and engage with us in this regard.
Absolutely. And thank you for that final point. And I really want to ask people, if you like the content, please like and subscribe. And as Willie say, please engage us. If you have difficult questions, we do not mind difficult questions. And perhaps we can shed some light on those and clarify a few points for everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Willie. I look forward to the next one. And enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Same for you.